Hi, my name is Mei Li Chai, and I'm an assistant professor in the creative writing department at San Francisco State. And I have a new book coming out called Useful Phrases for Immigrants, and it's a short story collection. The short stories take place in China and in the United States in the Chinese diaspora, and they all talk about immigration and migration and cultural changes over time. So I thought I'd read a short excerpt from one of the stories called The Body. And this short story was inspired by a play written in the 16th century by Tang Xianzu. It's called The Peony Pavilion. And in this play, which has been produced all over the world, including at Zellerbach Hall in Berkeley, it involves a love story between a man and a ghost. And in the traditional version, the ghost is a woman who is from the elite of society, and she dreams of her lover, but because she can't see him, she dies pining for love. And then a young man stops in a pavilion and is haunted by her. So I thought in updating this, I would, thinking about 21st century China, who might be visited by a ghost? And why would they only be able to fall in love after one of them had died? And that made me think about migrant workers in China. So this is a section from the story called The Body, and it's the section called The Migrant Worker. At night, in the room he shared with 11 other men, Xiaojun no longer dreamed of his village tucked into the side of Song Mountain, surrounded by pines. He did not dream of the sound of the ducks in old Mrs. Meng's pond, or the crowing of his grandfather's roosters, or the snorting of the hogs the entire village used to raise, until there were no young people left to manage the work, and the old heads left behind were too weak, bones too brittle to do it for themselves, and the last hog was sold. In the year before he returned, briefly for 3 days for Lunar New Year, to bring presents and cash for his grandparents and his young sisters. His parents had not returned that year. They had left when he was 8 to work in the factories in southern China, and they returned at first every year, but then only occasionally. They said their bosses wouldn't pay them, wouldn't give them time off, but other parents returned to check on their left-behind children. Xiaojun wasn't sure if his parents were telling the truth. He used to study hard so that his grandparents could brag about his marks and make his parents feel guilty about leaving such a diligent child. But after they stopped coming home at all, and he took on more chores for his grandparents, it was harder to make top marks, and then the teacher left, and Xiaojun stopped bothering to study. He stopped dreaming of his grandmother's cooking, of the steaming bowls of hand-pulled noodles and patiently wrapped half-moon dumplings, the freshly pickled cabbage in the smooth rice porridge, the fried pig ears and peppers, the velvety spinach, the slivered carrots, the long-dried green beans with cubes of tender tofu. Instead, for a long time, more than a year and 3 months, he dreamed the sleep of the dead, coming back from the construction crews where he worked, picked up concrete and copper wires and lead pipes and chunks of other debris and loaded it into wheelbarrows. Sometimes he pushed the wheelbarrow from one end of a dirt field to deposit its contents on the other end in a new growing mountain of debris, and sometimes he broke the chunks of broken buildings further with a pickaxe or a shovel or a strong piece of pipe. On some sites, he had been made to climb up the sides of buildings to wash windows of newly built skyscrapers, sitting on the edge of a rocking wood plank while the wind whistled in his ears, his legs wet from the squeegee dripping in his hand and the bucket of soapy water at his side. In the beginning, he'd been afraid of falling. There were no nets. Spider workers like him didn't need nets. He knew if he fell, it would be considered his fault, and the bosses would be more pleased to be rid of him outright than forced to pay for nets that might catch his body before it hit the pavement below. But later, he learned to watch the clouds float by on the glass in front of him. Sometimes he could imagine he was flying, and sometimes he could imagine that instead he was swimming in the vast bowl of the sky. The clouds reflected before him, the noise and filth of the city lost below. But now on this job, he was back to picking up debris, and his body hurting in both new and familiar ways. For months he'd slept the sleep of the dead, no dreams at all, his body so tired he fell into a black pool of nothingness the moment his body hit his cot, oblivious to the snores and farts and honking, wheezing noises of the men sleeping in the bunks around him. Then he'd found the girl's body. She was young, maybe his age, 17 or maybe a few years older, but beautiful, even in death, not bruised and damaged, not broken the way he'd imagined a body to be amidst the rubble. Her skin was pale, her hair long and black like a crow, her lips full, the nose straight. She had sharp clavicles and full breasts. He hadn't meant to see them, but she was naked, lying there. At first, he thought she was asleep. He'd imagined she was homeless, a poor migrant girl, someone like himself, a girl from a village who was lost in the city, and she'd gone to sleep in the empty building, a deep, tired sleep, and she hadn't heard the noise, and the wrecking ball had struck the old apartment building, and she died before she could even wake, lost in her dreams of her village. But one of the men who had almost graduated from high school before he'd left his village had seen a newspaper, and he claimed the reporter said the girl had not been killed by the crane. She had already been dead. The crane had merely opened up the floor of the building where her body had been stashed, fresh, recently killed. The other men had laughed salaciously. A wild chicken, they claimed, a prostitute, no doubt. Why else was she naked? Xiaojun had blushed when he heard them, not out of shame, out of anger. He felt protective of the girl whose body he'd found. His sharp eyes had caught sight of the pallor of her flesh against the jumble of broken walls. Other men had scaled the building, pulled her body out, brought it to the field, laid it there until the police could come, but he had been the first to see her. Even though he'd never touched her flesh, it was to him that her ghost returned every night. He was not asleep. The first time she had arrived, he had not worked for 3 days. First, the police had closed down the construction site to conduct their investigation, which the other men understood to be a ruse to force the owner of the construction company and the owner of the shopping center they were building to come up with enough bribe money to make the investigation go in their favor. And then the Taoist priest arrived with his gongs and drums and incense and firecrackers and wails that let every passing pedestrian know that someone had died, and now this was an unlucky sight, and they might catch the spirit's unhappiness too. This continued on and off for 2 days until the police came and roughed up the priest. On the 4th day, the priest returned, but the foreman paid him off himself rather than calling the police. Maybe paying the priest was cheaper than paying the police. Xiaojun didn't know. At any rate, he knew the priest was a fraud. He was no one who could help the girl's unhappy ghost. He knew because the ghost was still there. Despite the man's gongs and drums and firecrackers and loud wails, Xiaojun had seen her. During those 3 days that he did not work but merely stood around and squatted with the other men, waiting to be told when to go back to work, he also did not sleep. He lay in the dark of the crowded, noisy room, and as much as he wanted to fall asleep and try to dream of his village or his grandparents or his younger sister's faces, or even to fall into the dark, deep, black pit when he was too tired to sleep and awoke the next morning feeling that he had not slept at all, but he could not sleep. He stared into the darkness, and then suddenly she was there. She stood before his bed. She was naked just as he had found her, but he could barely make out the contours of her body. She shimmered, her mouth opening and closing, but he could not hear her voice. He could not understand what she said. He lay in terror, rigid, afraid to move a muscle, a finger, a toe, until at last she disappeared without a sound, and all that was left of her visit was his erect penis to remind him that she had been there at all. The next night she spoke again, or at least she opened and closed her mouth, but he couldn't make out any sound. Her face was neutral, no sign of distress, neither fear, nor anger, nor sadness. Her eyes were open and seemed to stare directly at him. "What do you want?" he called out. He hoped the other men would hear, would awaken and see her too and cry out and make her go away. The moment he shouted, she disappeared. The other men did not wake up. The third night, she appeared at the end of his bunk, the same as the previous 2 nights, and he sat up, less afraid now that she was more familiar. He had been waiting, hoping she'd come. He leaned closer so that he could see better, try to understand what she was trying to say. But this night, the ghost didn't stop at the end of his bed. She climbed onto his thin cotton mattress, and he pulled the sheets open for her instinctively, not because she was naked, but because she seemed as though she might be cold. And she was cold, cold, but not like the draft from the window that never quite closed, but cold like water, like the lake outside his village, where he used to swim with his classmates, late at night after his grandparents had gone to sleep. He and his friends would run in the dark, giggling past the rice paddies and the sleeping ducks and the water buffalo that stood sleepily in the ditches alongside the dirt roads, through the reeds and the mud until splash! They were screaming with delight in the cold water that sucked the air out of his lungs, and his legs pumped in the water, kicking, his arms splashing as he dove up and down in the lake like a boy turned fish, feeling free for the only time in his 17 years of life. That cold enveloped him now, as the ghost straddled his body, and his heart beat, beat, beat in his chest, and he rocked with the girl, her cold body over his warm one. She cooled the ache in his bones, the swollen purple bruises on his tan skin. Back and forth, like waves, they rocked together until all the pain in his body had seeped into the ice and was gone. And that is an excerpt from The Body.